Today I'm going to do some file handling in Python. Now, first thing we need to do is we need to have a simple text file. I've got a file here called highscores.txt. If I open it up, you can see it contains 3 names and 3 scores, 1 per line. Now, to be able to read in a file in Python, first of all we need to use the open command, which will open up the file of a certain name. Now, ours was called highscores, so I'll type that in. We have to include .txt, and we have to say what we're going to do with the file. Now, R means to read the file, W means to write the file, and W plus means to append, to write to the end of the file. Now, to start with, we're just going to read from the file. This open command returns a pointer to the file. Now, I'm just going to call it FO for file open. So whenever I want to do anything with a file, I refer to the variable FO. Now, obviously, we could do with reading from the file. So I'm going to have a variable just called lines, which is going to read all the lines from the file. I put in FO because that was the pointer to the file that's open, and there is a read lines command. So the file open will read all the lines and store them in the variable called lines. Now, it's always good practice to close your file after you've finished working with it. So I'll close the file because I've read the data from there, and then just to see what we've got, let's print out whatever's in the variable called lines. If we run our little program, you'll see that it is read in Bob 12, Steve 10, and Dave 6. Now, if you notice, they have /n at the end. If you look at our file, we didn't have any /n's. /n is a hidden, it's actually 1 character, but it takes up 2 characters when we print it out, which means new line. So if you think about it, we have Bob, and then we've pressed return for a new line, then we have 12, we press return, then Steve, and they are all strings. Now later, we're going to have to convert these numbers into type integer by using the cast function. We have all of our data in one data structure called lines. It's actually a list. So what we could do is splitting up, really. So I'm going to have one list called names, one list called scores. Now that has just created them as empty lists. So what we need to do is we need to split them up. Now I'm going to loop through my lines variable. So I say for I in range, and I could just type the numbers in, but I'm going to be a bit more cunning, and I'm going to say whatever the length of lines is. Now, I know that actually I have got 6 items in my list, and I don't really want to have more than 6 items, but if I was to change my mind and decide to have, rather than the top 3 scores, have the top 10 scores, I wouldn't have to actually change my for loop, because my for loop would cope with however many names and scores are in that file. Now, normally we just have these 2 values in a for loop, but as I said before, and there is a little tutorial on for loops, you can put another parameter in, and I'm actually going to put a number 2 in. This means it's going to add 2 every time it goes around the loop. If you don't put a parameter in, it just adds 1. The reason I'm adding 2 is because I have 2 pieces of data I want to take out. Now, the first piece of data is I'm going to get the name. So I'm going to append whatever is the ith position in lines to my list that was called names. Now, the next item is actually the score. So actually I'm going to take the next item and append it to the scores list. Now, this obviously would be I plus 1. So what this is going to do is going to take item 0 and item 1 and put them in the list. Then my loop will add on 2, so it will go from 0 to 2. And it will add item 2 and 3 onto the list. Then it will add another 2, because remember I is 2 this time, so to item 4, and add item 4 and 5 into my lists. So it's just a nice way of being able to get every other item in. Now, as I said before, scores needs to be converted into an integer, so we might as well do that now. As we've got the data in lines, we need to actually cast it. And you do that with int, and then you put the item in brackets. So it will take whatever is inside here, which currently is a string, it'll make it into an integer, so scores will actually have a list of integers. So when we print out scores, it won't have the /n on the end because they won't be a string, it will now be a number. So why don't we just test to see if this does what we expect. So what we're going to do is we'll just print out the names and then we'll print out the scores. And we'll just test it. As you can see here, we still have our original print, which prints out all of the data. We then print out the 3 names, we then print out the 3 scores. If you notice, the scores do not have speech marks around the outside and they don't have the /n, they are now numbers. So we've got our data which is in the correct format and it's in 2 little lists, a names list and a scores list. Now we could either get names and scores from the keyboard, but to save typing things in, I'm actually just going to make 2 variables. So I'm going to have one variable which is the new score of 11 and one variable which is Fred. And I'm actually going to put a /n at the end of here. When you read something from the keyboard, you will actually read it in with a /n because you press return at the end of the data you enter in from the keyboard. So rather than entering it in, I'm just going to put it in here manually, but also Fred will then have a return character at the end for when we're writing to the file. So it will actually be the same format as all the other names and it'll be ready for later. As a human, you can look through the numbers and you can see that Bob has 12, Steve has 10, Dave has 6. So Fred with his score of 11 has to go between Bob and Steve. So we Bob 12, Fred 11, Steve 10, and Dave would disappear off the top 3. It's easy for us to do, but we've got to tell the computer to do it. So what we're going to do is we're going to list through the scores. We've got 12, 10 and 6. And while our new score is smaller than the score I'm looking at, we're going to keep cycling through them. So I'm going to look at my scores, and if 11 is less than 12, which it is, I'm going to keep on going. I look at the next one, is 11 less than 10? No, it's not. So I'm going to stop, and I'm going to put my score in there. So it's going to cycle through until it finds the correct place to put it in. Now the easy way to do that is we just put in a while loop. Remember, a while loop will loop around until a condition is met. And we want to keep going around until the new, while the new score is less than the score that I'm looking at. Now the score I'm going to look at, I'm just going to call it J. And it's going to start off being the score in the first position. I'm going to look at that, and while it's not in the right place, I will add one onto the score. So it will try to look at the score that's in the next position. Okay. Now when we found the right position, what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert the new score into that position J. Let's just type it in, so new name this is going to be, and then I need to do the same for scores. I need to insert the new score into there. So hopefully this will work. Let's have a little try and see what happens. But before we test it, let's just add a little bit of code to print out the names and the scores, otherwise we won't actually see anything on our output screen. Oops, I've got a little typing error, and that's because I forgot my S on scores. We'll try that one again. Now as you can see, my old scores were 12, 10 and 6, they're now 12, 11, 10, 6. And also we had Bob, Steve, Dave, now we got Bob, Fred, Steve, Dave. So quite correctly it has put Fred in the correct position. Now we've got our data, but we could do with updating our high score table, because if you actually look at our text file, all we've done is read the data from it. We haven't updated anything. So we could do with updating the table with our new scores. So we need to open up our file again. Again, I can just use FO again. I can just do open, and I'm still doing the same file, so it's still highscores.txt. But this time I'm going to write to the file. Now writing to the file means that anything that was in the file will be deleted. Now I only actually want to put 3 scores in, so I'm actually going to put a comment line in saying only the first 3. Okay, and the comment line is just a hashtag, it comes up red. That's just for us, just so that people know that when they're reading the code, that's what I intended to do, because people might think, oh, hold on, we've got 4 scores, you've only written 3 of them, you forgot to write one in. Well, I've done that deliberately because I only want to write in the first 3. If I only want to write in the first 3, I can use a for loop to go around to write them. And I'm going to say for, again I can use I, it doesn't really matter, it's just a counter. I say for I in range, and I want to go round 0, 3, which means I'll be going round 0, 1, 2, which is 3 times in total. And I want to write something to my file. Now fo.write is how you write to a file. I obviously want to write the names, and I'm going to write the ith name. So first it's going to write Bob, then it's going to write Fred, then it's going to write Steve. But remember, I want to write the name and then the score. So I also need to do fo.write and also write the scores. And this is the ith one again, because it's going to write out score 12, then score 11, then score 10. Now remember, scores is actually an integer, and write wants to have a string. So we need to do that thing called casting to turn our integer into a string so it can be written. Now we have got one last little thing to do, in that we actually need to put the return character on the end of the score, so it is completely correct and back to how it was. So what this should do is it should print out the name of Bob, the score of 12, and then go to a new line. Because remember, Bob already goes to a new line. Then it'll do Fred, new line, and 11, new line. Then it'll do Steve, new line, and 10, new line. So if I just quickly, before I run it, just double check high scores. High scores still has Bob, Steve, and Dave. When we run the program, it should be replacing Dave by putting Fred in between Bob and Steve. The last thing you need to do is you need to close your file. Some people forget to close the file. If you don't close your file, it won't save your changes, which means you'll do all of this code, you'll run the program, but for some reason you won't have anything written in your file. That's because the close didn't force the save. Now before we test it, we will just double check. I open up my high scores, I have Bob, Steve, and Dave. The next time we open it up, I am hoping that Fred will have appeared and Dave will not be on our file anymore. So let's run our program and see what happens. As far as our data out goes, it still looks the same, but let's look at our file. And as you can see, yes, Fred has appeared, Steve is now in 3rd place, because it's removed our last position, which was Dave. So there is some basic file handling. The key things to remember is that you open your file either to read or to write, and when you've finished reading or writing, you must close your file, and whenever you read data in, it will be read in as a string, so therefore you may need to convert it into an integer if you want to work with it numerically, and also when you're trying to write your data back out, if you're writing an integer, you need to convert it back into a string again. And I think that's about it for files.